And again, we're very excited to welcome Baringa, the Baringa team today to talk about their grid resilience and climate change impacts, or GRACI, project on prioritization and valuation. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Paul and his team to get us started.
Thank you, Kirsten, for the introduction and for allowing us to present today during the NASIO call. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Sayor. I work at Baringa. Baringa is a global management consultancy that specializes in energy and resources. I'm on the U.S. utilities team located in New York City, and we sort of have a deep spike in the resilience space. I'm joined by my colleagues, Michael Levy, partner and global head of asset resilience, and Camille Vanderwaat, who help support a lot of this analysis for the program. So worked with many of you on the call over the past year. We've been working on the technical assistance program for the 401(d) funding, which is titled Grid Resilience and Climate Change Impacts, otherwise known as GRACI. And over the past year, we've been exploring how extreme weather in the future and historically impact energy assets, and how that information can be used to optimally allocate 401(d) funding. So this has been going on for about 12 months. This is the last installment of the program where we would like to review our methodology for valuing and prioritizing resilience investments. And although this work through GRACI has been specifically with 11 states, in WEC, we thought that this information was particularly important and wanted to socialize it with the larger NASIO group. So our agenda for today, we're going to cruise through the project background section and go to the methodology overview and purpose, where we step through all 4 steps, talk a little bit about prioritizing and integrating asset risks, and then implementation, next steps. And as Kirsten mentioned, we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions along the way, however, my colleagues will be monitoring the chat, post them in there, and we'll address them as we go. So like I mentioned, we are working with 11 states in WEC to provide technical assistance, specifically for 401(d), but also understanding extreme weather risk more broadly. I mentioned that this is the final of a 4-phase project through GRACI. The first phase was sort of a get to know you, learn a little bit more about the concerns in these specific states. Then we produced what we call grid resilience reports, where we looked at future extreme weather risk in those states and how they impacted assets. We did a historical look back with a little bit more of an outage focus, where we're looking at how extreme weather historically has caused outages in these states, and essentially the severity and frequency of these. And now we're moving on to the 4th phase, which is the prioritization and valuation methodology. And this is just a timeline and work plan of what we've done. You can see we're sort of wrapping this up. In terms of communication materials, Kirsten mentioned that this webinar will be recorded. We're also writing up a report that details this methodology with a little bit more granularity, and that will be sort of distributed immediately to the 11 states that we're working with, but we're hoping to get this information out a little bit more broadly. And overall, we'll be hosting a landing page that's sort of in the works that hosts all of the information, all of the reports that we've done, including this webinar and the report on the methodology for everyone to access going forward. So when we talk about resilience risk and today's methodology, there's really 3 objectives that we're looking to accomplish with this framework. The first is to quantify future extreme weather risk. And there's 2 operative words here. The first one is quantify. And when we say quantify, we mean convert this risk into dollars. And the second operative word here is future. And so we're looking at how extreme weather will proliferate over time, over the geographies that we're looking at out to 2050, out to 2100. The second objective of this methodology is to justify resilience investments. And what we mean by that is we're looking to substantiate actual capital projects and explain why these investments give us the most value for the least cost. And then once we do those things, overall, we prioritize capital portfolios by the most beneficial, least cost investments all the way down until we exhausted our capital budgets. And by doing these things, we try to accomplish three benefits. The first, we reduce customer costs. We want to lower bills through this because we know that our money is going into the right place, and we're optimizing benefits and minimizing costs. The second benefit is improved grid reliability. When we install adaptations, work on capital mitigations, overall, we're looking to reduce failures on the grid. And then the third one, which is pretty obvious, is reducing utility ignitions as well. A lot of these investments are for wildfire mitigation. We all know that this is very pertinent in the West, but it extends to other hazards as well. Now, it's important to note that the methodology that we're walking through today is primarily for asset owners, so for the utilities. As you know, they have the data, they are doing the operation and the capital planning specifically, but this methodology is very important for the state energy offices as well. And the first reason is because state energy offices are actually in a very unique position. They're not a regulator. They have frequent and existing touch points with utilities. SEOs administer grant funding, and so truthfully, the state energy offices are in a unique position to build relationships with utilities. And from all the work that we do through this program and outside this program with utilities, that's sort of what we've heard echoed from them as well, is that they're looking to build relationships with the state energy offices because they sort of see them as a trusted department that's neutral. And so there's an opportunity to leverage that relationship to educate utilities on best practices in terms of resilience risk and failure modeling. The other two pieces here are policy and funding related. Learning about this methodology can sort of be used to revamp state policy goals, resilience targets and reliability goals, potentially you rethink utility regulations with the PUCs and the PSCs, and then also improve administration of funding. Where there's areas where utilities have quantified benefits, you can help use this framework to prioritize certain investments based on that. So with that, we'll get into the methodology, and the remainder of the deck and presentation really double clicks on each of these four steps, but I wanted to highlight it at a high level first. The first step is looking at extreme weather forecasts. So you want to understand how the weather will behave in the future, and you want to do this for the entire service territory or geography that you're looking at, and do this for every asset class across all hazards. And you can see that the hazards that we typically do this for are on the right side of the screen, and there's about 7 or 8 of them there. And there's a couple different methodologies for converting this for specific hazards, but generally this methodology is hazard and asset class agnostic. The second step is understanding how these assets will be impacted by that future weather. And so this is where the modeling piece comes in. And so we model the probability of asset failure given extreme wind out to 2050, given extreme heat in certain areas. The third step is risk. And when we say risk, we really mean dollars. And the key piece to this framework is converting the exposure and the failure probability into expected cost. And so this is the step where we do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the tricks and techniques for converting to that dollar value. And then lastly, adaptation. We want to understand what the pre-investment risk is today, which is steps 1 through 3, and then evaluate how is this investment going to improve our reliability, improve our resilience. And so you run the same models before and after this adaptation, and you look at sort of the delta between the risk profiles that you see after that. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the techniques and the modeling specifications for doing that. So the first step that we want to double click on is extreme weather projections. And just a little bit of a note on the presentation, we've standardized this so that each section starts with a slide on methodology. We have an illustrative example to help us step through the framework. We'll talk through an example output, so a sample deliverable, and then talk through some SEO considerations. But the first step here is we're looking at investments that help us in the future. And so we need to understand what the climate is going to do in the future. And so we want to procure high resolution extreme weather projections for the locations of the assets that we're looking to upgrade. And so what does this mean? The climate science community uses global climate models, GCMs, to predict how certain weather variables will behave. But unfortunately, the granularity is very coarse. Typically, these values and these outputs sit at about 100 square kilometers. While this is useful in some respect, it's not very useful from an investment planning perspective, because we want to know how the unique weather is going to behave for each asset. So the climate science community has developed a process called downscaling, where they use statistical and physics-based methods to increase the granularity of outputs into something that is usable for investment planning. And so you could see on the right, the outputs from the global climate model can be sort of illustrated by that top grid, where you have some values for wind speeds, let's say, but they're at 100 square kilometers. The downscaling process increases the number of grid cells so that you can map these outputs to specific assets. And of course, this is not to scale. Typically, the granularity that we work with is 90 square meters. So it's a significant increase in resolution, going from the 100 square kilometers to 90 square meters. So you can really be surgical about the climate projections and mapping those to specific assets. One example of this, as you can see on the right, this is some work that's been done by Columbia researchers for projecting extreme flood risk in Manhattan and Brooklyn. This is from Columbia's International Research Institute for Climate and Society. And why do we do this? We do this, again, because we want to get asset level insights. An important piece here is that this is probability based. A lot of planning and modeling is done in scenarios, and you'll hear that with things like transmission planning. What scenarios do we want to develop and explore with our modeling? I think the difference here is that with scenario modeling, it's good because you can sort of tease out specific parameters, but it doesn't give you the probability of those scenarios actually happening. And so it's very difficult to substantiate investments against something that you don't know the probability of occurrence. And that is different with what we're doing here. All of these climate projections basically give you a range of probabilities, a probability distribution of possible outcomes and possible flood values in this case, or possible wind speeds. And so that gives the capital planner the ability to account for a range of outcomes simultaneously, rather than running a handful of scenarios. And this is very crucial for some of the later pieces in the methodology. And so what does this mean for state energy offices? I think the first consideration is encouraging utilities to leverage public and private extreme weather data. This is the first step to understanding how to substantiate risk. It's great to look at historical data, but we know through the climate science community that the climate is changing. And so basing some of this analysis on historical indices might not lead you to the most accurate outcomes. And so what we've done is we've aggregated a list of publicly available data sets that have these extreme weather projections And these are available in different sorts of formats. We're very familiar with all these, and so if you have any questions, please feel to reach out. But these are linked, and you'll get access to this presentation. And so working with utilities to understand how to use these and how to analyze these and integrate them into the planning practices is sort of the first step for getting them comfortable with this information. There's also other resources available for those of you that we worked with through Gracie, working with utilities and explaining the insights from the grid resilience reports. The state of the grid reports is another good step to getting movement towards, extreme weather projections and using that for capital planning. I want to pause here and pose a question to the group, an opportunity for people to share their experiences. What are some of the hazards that you are most concerned with, and why? When we worked with the states in the West, obviously wildfire is a big concern, but I want to hear from people who have experience with other hazards, but perhaps winter storms, hurricanes, and feel free to just come off mute and chime in and explain some of your highest concerns.
This is Kyla in Montana. I'll just say that for us, and as your report showed for our state, high wind events and winter storms have been a pretty big concern. And this is in addition to wildfire, which is a key concern.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Kyla. That's been where a lot of our work has been, is in the wildfire and extreme wind side. I'm wondering if there's anyone from the Southeast on the call that could share some of their experience with hurricanes and high wind and hurricanes.
This is Eric Schmidt. Let's see, come on, coming on camera here. So Tennessee, just broadly, is in an interesting place. I would say we don't get hurricanes, but now we've got hurricanes with Hurricane Helene, Ben Bolton. We're on our call. I could tell you so much more. But it's my general point is that we almost get all of them now.
Yeah.
You can get a hurricane. We don't have, the extreme nor'easter, but we do get snow and ice. And so we have the extremes of both high heat and, it gets down to low single digits in the most extreme cases. But the tornado belt has shifted eastward. And I really appreciated your comment as far as modeling and using historical data doesn't necessarily cut it, because it does seem to be changing so quickly. And even this summer has been particularly, just even the smallest storm can produce so much rain now.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have isolated flash flooding as well as prolonged flash flooding. And then we also get straight line winds. So it really runs the gamut. And test the grid substantially. So, but it's just great to listen along and see the specificity of the modeling to kind of fine tune that too, because I do think it's case by case. West Tennessee to Middle Tennessee to East Tennessee can be very different. So, just wanted to speak up and share for the group what Tennessee looks at.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Eric. I mean, I think you nailed a couple key things here. One being that using high resolution climate projections will lead you to accurate answers, because we're seeing changes in extreme weather, but also because of the microclimates. And so using, even 50 square kilometer data might not give you the resolution that you need based on the specific microclimates and geographies, even within a single state. And then the other point being the coincident hazard. So I think a big report that stuck out to me in the past is the Blue Ribbon report from Winter Storm Elliott with TVA. And they did a really good job sort of analyzing how they were impacted by the winter storm. And then obviously there's hurricane risk there as well. And so it's sort of interesting feeling out how utilities need to adapt to multi-hazards simultaneously and multi-hazards within a single year.
Yeah.
Let's jump back to the framework and talk a little bit more about modeling. So the second step here is exposure. And so we use these downscaled climate projections to predict failure. And there's a few different ways in which we predict failure. The first step here is aligning on how assets fail, otherwise failure modes. And you can see an example of sort of this process and sort of ideating failure modes in the table on the bottom, where we think about the impacts of extreme weather to distribution poles and conductors. So extreme heat can cause line sag and interaction with vegetation. Extreme cold can cause radial icing and increase mechanical loading on poles. And extreme wind can cause lean and down poles immediately. And so once you align on the ways in which assets fail, you want to understand the point at which they fail, and this is called failure thresholds. So for poles, will poles fail at around 90 miles per hour? And working with the asset owners, working with the engineers to understand the design thresholds, the design standards, the failure thresholds, can really help you with this, so that you can set up your modeling properly. And then what you want to do is actually map all of the assets on a system to the climate points that you've previously procured. And the example on the right can kind of show you this general network with conductors, transmission towers, poles, and substations overlaid on the climate projections. And when you're doing this modeling, you actually want to create a tabular association between all of the individual climate points and all the assets on the system, so that each asset has a unique climate profile. Now, we know that poles don't all fail in the same way. And so when we think through these static thresholds, you might not actually lead you to the most accurate answer to just assume that all poles, regardless of age, regardless of condition, wear and tear, will fail at 90 miles an hour. And so you can increase complexity by using something called fragility curves. And these fragility curves give you a dynamic threshold of failure based on certain parameters like age of the pole, lean of the pole, et cetera. And when we do this work for utilities, we actually derive these failure curves based on their historical asset failure and inspection data, so that we have a failure curve that is most accurate to their assets and their geography. But you can find these fragility curves in industry literature that's sort of publicly available if you're looking to sort of increase the complexity of your modeling.
Hey, Paul, I just wanted to add here. So what we're seeing with a lot of utilities is that empirical derivation of these curves can be really tough based on data challenges. So they may not have the installation date of a lot of their poles, or they might not know the condition of the poles, or they might not know the loading or the vegetation density or things like that. And a lot of those different features matter in terms of determining the relative sensitivity to extreme wind. And so what we see some utilities now moving towards is creating what's called like a dynamic digital twin. And that's using a physics-based model. And so you might see some products out there that use LiDAR data to construct a digital twin. And that allows the utility to actually run a simulation under stress conditions. And then it can see, well, like at what wind speed would cause this pole with these loadings and so forth to actually break. So while that is an expensive option, it's if you don't have the data, then that tends to be, perhaps one of the only options. Alternatively, as Paul had noted, there are papers out there that have fragility curves that are for use publicly, but of course there's challenges that come with that, because the data set that was used to construct the fragility curves might not be representative of the assets that yours has. So when it comes to line assets in particular, using the simple threshold-based method, like Paul had noted, where you're just saying above a wind speed something fails, below wind speed it doesn't. That's obviously the most simple, but as you want to get more sophisticated in terms of the way that you're incorporating extreme weather risk, that physics-based model or the empirical derivation of fragility curves, those are both great options.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. That's actually a perfect segue into the next slide, which talks a little bit more about these data challenges and how important it is to have a foundational level of data to be able to conduct this. Our main recommendation for SEOs is when you're working with your utilities on risk modeling and resilience quantification, start simple. So start with the static threshold and understand the data that's available before you move forward with the more complex modeling like the fragility curves. And so you can ask simple questions to help them support their asset database, like, do they digitize their inspection records? Are there duplicates of their assets in their computerized maintenance management system? Have they been recording their install year for their polls and for some of their assets to help you pull out the parameters needed to create the fragility curves? A big one that we've seen is, do they have a functioning outage management system? For some of the smaller cooperatives, that might not be the case. And so they might not be recording in a systematic way outages and failures on their system. And so without these foundational data layers, there won't be enough information to go ahead and conduct this analysis. We want to move on to resilience risk. So this is one of the most critical steps in the framework, is the transformation from failure likelihood to dollars of risk. You can imagine that each failure has its own profile of costs associated with it. And so let's think of a failure of a pole. There's going to be repair costs that the utility is going to have to incur, or replacement costs. There's going to be downtime costs. So what is the cost to the customers, commercial, industrial, and residential, for having and experiencing that outage? And then for some utilities, what is the ignition cost? If there's a down pole and there's a live wire, that has a probability of ignition and a cost associated with that ignition, which can sometimes be sort of astronomical. And so what we do here is we take the probability of failure and we multiply it by the entire cost profile associated with that failure, and we arrive at expected risk. And you could see on the right that there's this example that, after you do this exercise for all assets on your system, for all cost types and all failures, you'll be able to aggregate by asset type and do some sort of stacked bar waterfall chart that really shows you the distribution of risk across the different cost types and across the different assets. So we do this work a lot with utilities. I'm going to turn it back to Michael to walk us through what we did for Ameren, Illinois, conducting an asset level vulnerability assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just had a few other comments to add on the prior slide, if you don't mind flipping back.
Yeah, of course.
So it's really important that the risk is denominated in dollars, and we've seen a lot of utilities debate heavily on this, where they'll forecast risk in that is unitless. It's just risk units. And I'm seeing, like, in California, originally there was a risk spin deficiency metric, but that's now shifting towards monetization. And you may see other utilities that will use asset health indices. Those types of analysis is useful for a relative ranking of riskiness of assets, but it really is insufficient in order to determine what's an appropriate level of spend for a portfolio. And really, unless the risk is monetized, it's really hard to comment on cost effectiveness, because the benefits are in some unit, not in dollars. right? So if the cost is in dollars and you want to calculate an NPV or benefit cost ratio, then the benefits should also, in this case, avoided risk should also be in dollars. And that's something that we're very firm on. So, what we've seen increasingly from regulators is that they want to be able to see substantiation of investments from that type of an analysis, and it requires monetization of risk. I'm curious to hear, maybe we'll open it up for the group. Are you guys seeing a similar trend in a push for risk monetization? And if not, why? I see some folks from California. Maybe I'll pick on you, particularly since there was a recent change or shift on the ramp filings to move from RSE to BCA. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the decision process there.
Hey, Michael, sorry. Could you repeat the question? Apologies.
Yeah, just curious if you could share for the rest of the group, speaking on behalf of California, what the thinking was moving away from risk spend efficiency towards a BCA type framework.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm coming back from maternity leave. So was this having to do with 401(d) or is this?
No. This is more talking about like the ramp filings, and perhaps might not be the best person to speak to that, but originally they were using risk spend efficiency, which is a unitless measure of value, and then have since shifted to monetization of risk as a way to substantiate spend.
Yeah, I don't think we have the answer that you're looking for, but I can follow up and get back to you.
Yeah, all good. Any input from other states if you've seen a push towards that type of an analysis?
I'll let Ryan chime in again here for Tennessee, but I think it depends. The level of sophistication of this modeling is probably something that a Tennessee Valley Authority or one of your more sophisticated local power companies of the 154 that distribute TVA's power. But even, I was formerly with the municipal government in Chattanooga, and so this level of analysis is I think really helpful, and the monetization I think is the selling point. But I think kind of to the Ryan's point in terms of frequency or it's sort of the severity. So it's are you going to having short duration but frequent outages with minimal damage, or are you having high voltage transmission lines that are torn down in a tornado, or even other generation assets that are more critical? I would just think so. This is just a kind of a general response, but from the landscape, this is higher than I have interacted with. But Ryan, if you've got anything, maybe through our engagement with ORNL to add there.
Yeah, sure. I think that especially in a space like a TVA service territory, we have a lot of local power companies that there may be more than what exists in other balancing authorities, and there usually aren't enough dollars to go around to even invest in automated outage management systems in many cases. So the situational awareness that would be required for this kind of analysis isn't always there, especially in some of these areas that um, could actually suffer a lot more under these natural hazards where their distribution level assets are a lot more vulnerable. TVA does collect a lot of data tied to these local power companies. But I think when it comes to granularity that could be fed into something like I don't know, like an ML model, that just isn't there right now. And I think ORNL has really taken the lead in getting these local power companies to invest more in their situational awareness, and even do some more work that might be tied to, will you even consider like daily operations to ensure reliability? So yeah, outside of, I would say, 5 or so utilities that sell more electricity, you're not going to see the level of situational awareness that's required for this analysis.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's worth clarifying that this is not an operational use case, it's a planning use case. So we're talking about prescribing a multi-year investment plan, not a restoration plan after an event. But this type of analysis actually, if you're not doing a more complex version where you're using a fragility curve, you can do this type of analysis with very minimal information. In fact, like the two minimal pieces of information you would need to know is the location of the assets and their design standards. And even that you could potentially use like the NESC electric code. So what we're talking about here actually requires very little information from a utility. Now it can get more complicated depending on the level of accuracy and sophistication that you want, but there's no situational awareness or anything that's required in order to do this type of work. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth noting because especially in some of these rural areas, um, yeah, many of them aren't staffed by many folks at all, and even having someone who could map these assets that goes beyond like thumbtacks on a cork board,
Yeah.
sometimes that can even be a lot to ask for.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. Saw someone else had their hand raised or wanted to jump in there.
I think we're running a little tight on time, Michael.
Cool.
So
Yeah, so I'll
why don't we
continue.
move
Yeah,
forward?
thanks for the engagement on that. So just racing through this. This is a high level model schematic that was implemented at a Midwest utility we're working with closely, Ameren, Illinois. This is publicly available as part of the climate plan that we're supporting for them, but we're actually integrating 3 different types of risk that you see indicated by the 3 rows on the left-hand side of the chart here. Resilience risk, which is risk from extreme weather, reliability risk, which in this case for line assets is integrated with resilience risk, and that's age and condition driven replacements, and then capacity driven, which is demand driven investments or violations from overloaded substations, substation transformers, and then monetizing all of the risk at the asset level from each of those 3 different elements, and then integrating them into an asset investment plan, and then using that as the basis for prioritizing the assets from an NPV. So in this case, Ameren is using a software called Copperleaf to do the investment prioritization. Many of you have probably heard of that software before, but if you don't have Copperleaf, that's not something that's a prerequisite to being able to do an analysis like this. And also, you don't have to do everything that you see on this page. If you wanted to start with a very basic analysis, like I had mentioned, where you're just forecasting dollars of risk by asset from extreme weather using a simple threshold-based method, that alone is useful and can inform design standards and also relative sequencing of investments.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. I think there are some other basic tools available to start to tease out resilience risk before moving into the asset level vulnerability assessments. And those things could be the ICE calculator, Presto, both tools from LBNL, which are very useful and we use sometimes in our analysis. And you use these tools to help understand the cost profile of failure. The repair and replacement costs of a failure of a pole is pretty easy to come by the utility has their own internal cost assumptions. But when it comes to societal costs, we use something called value of lost load. And the ICE calculator helps you derive that. And the definition of the value of lost load is the economic value, typically expressed in monetary terms, that electricity consumers place on reliable electricity service and would be willing to pay to avoid an interruption. And so a large portion of the costs and the risks, as you guys all know, of these failures is an outage and cost to the community. And so this is a key part for people to understand when it comes to modeling resilience risk. The last step in the methodology is adaptation. So after we procure the climate projections, after you map those climate projections to assets and understand how they fail and at what point they fail, and then after you convert that failure to risk, you need to select potential investments that will help to reduce or eliminate that risk entirely. And so in our example to the right, which is our sort of throughput example, illustrative example, we've added to the graphic installation of concrete poles, upgrading tower class, installing relays, undergrounding conductors, decreasing span, just normal mitigations for overhead assets, and for distribution automation. What these investments do is they decrease the failure probability of these assets. So those static thresholds that we talked about when it comes to a pole failing at 90 miles an hour, by installing a concrete pole, that pole will now fail at, let's say, 110, 120, decreasing that probability of failure and therefore decreasing the risk of failure. And so when it comes to modeling this, what you do is you choose the adaptation, you modify the static threshold of failure, and then you rerun the model. And you evaluate and compare the pre-investment risk of running the model sort of status quo. And you compare that to the post-investment risk that you see after changing that failure threshold and simulating the installation of that investment. And that delta between the post investment and the pre-investment risk is the overall benefit of that investment. Now, this is really useful, and Michael mentioned this earlier, because when you understand the avoided cost, which is the benefit in dollars here, you can compare that directly to the cost of that investment and build a quantitative business case in the terms of net present value for the lifetime of the investment or benefit cost ratio. And this type of analysis will supercharge the 401(d) applications, but also capital planning writ large for utilities, and sort of equip them with the data and the analysis to make these smart and optimized investment decisions in their capital portfolio. This is just a quick example of sample output where we do this analysis for every single asset on the system, and we evaluate that pre-investment versus post-investment and compare across the two. And this is discounted back into 2025 dollars. Now we're running a little bit tight on time. I'll just cruise through this section briefly, and so we can get to the Q&A portion. And Michael mentioned this earlier. We're doing this with Ameren. Resilience risk is very important, and it's critical for the 401(d) work that we're all sort of engaging in and becoming increasingly an issue. However, there are other network needs and asset risks that are out there as well, primarily capacity risks. So thermal violations on the system from increased load, from interconnection, and then also reliability risk. And this is all sorts of asset failures that are not weather induced. And then there's transition risk on the decarbonization side. But these are all risks that need to be evaluated simultaneously in an integrated way at a utility, so that the utility can address the most risk for the least amount of dollars at the same time. And we're doing this work at Ameren, and so to help illustrate that, We assess capacity risk and reliability risk for all their feeders. And you can see the capacity risk is on the x-axis and the reliability is on the y-axis. The investments that are prioritized to be addressed first are the ones in that big red section where there's both high capacity and high reliability risk. And that's priority 1. Priority 2, typically for utility, are capacity related investments. And those are prioritized over reliability investments like replacing assets on their system. But as you see from this chart, there are a number of feeders that actually have a higher reliability risk, so a total dollar value of risk, than some of these other feeders on the capacity side. Yet these capacity investments will be treated as non-discretionary over Group 3. And what that means is that the utility may be deferring higher risk feeders for investment at a later date and not optimizing their capital allocation. And we can illustrate that through feeder A, which has fairly low capacity risk, but will be prioritized over feeder B, which actually is a higher risk feeder overall. We do this work in resilience, and then we also quantify across reliability, capacity, and transmission. And at the end of the day, we want to prioritize investments in a utility's capital portfolio, aggregated across all risks simultaneously, and then sorted from greatest to lowest. And so this would be sort of a general illustration of how a capital portfolio would look like. In terms of implementation, I think we've touched on a little bit of this during the presentation and through some of the engagement from you folks. Typically, a lot of utilities aren't doing this work. If they are doing it, it's maybe historically driven from historical weather, but maybe not quantified and monetized for a dollar figure. And so where most of the industry is at is sort of in this orange box here. What we want to move the industry towards is this middle box, the asset level vulnerability assessments, where we are using high resolution climate projections. We are using the GPS coordinates of the assets and mapping them to those projections and quantifying risk at the asset level. A great example of this is Southern California Edison is actually doing this with their CAVA report. And so if people are interested, they should look towards that. Some of our work that we're doing with Ameren is public facing. And so if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us after this. And sort of the final form of the industry is you getting a climate adjusted asset investment plan overall. And so you're looking at the cost benefit trade-offs across all asset needs, as well as across all asset types as well. So not just looking at overhead assets, but looking at overhead, transmission, distribution as well, and then potentially moving up into generation too, and being asset agnostic with the entirety of your integrated capital plan. And so if there's 4 takeaways from this presentation that I want to hone in on, the first is to work with your state utilities. The SEOs are in a unique position to do this. The utilities want to build a relationship with them. And so it's important for the SEOs to educate utilities on best practices when it comes to risk quantification and failure modeling. Second here is you can use the concepts that we talked about today to consider revamping requirements for extreme weather analysis in your state. Potentially, there's a lot of states in the West that have robust wildfire mitigation plan submission requirements. There could be an opportunity here to expand that to be multi-hazard as well, given the sort of synergies across, wind, temperature, and wildfire. And then there could be an opportunity to establish a linkage between this type of work and the state energy security plans to develop investment strategies at the state level. The next is aiding utilities in assessing alignment of their existing asset plans to future risks. So at a minimum, evaluating the existing capital plans, the 5-year plan that utilities have, and aligning that to the future risk that you're seeing from the climate projections, even if it's the publicly available ones. And then our last recommendation is for utilities to conduct an asset level vulnerability assessment. And you could start small, start with the sort of static thresholds that we discussed, and then moving towards more complex methods of modeling. But working with those utilities to figure out how to accomplish this is critical. So in terms of resources, we are creating a Gracie landing page, which will have all of the deliverables that we worked on for all 11 states across the program, as well as this webinar, was the more detailed report that we'll be producing, and this will be publicly available so that you guys can link it to internal stakeholders, PUC, and then also utilities as well. And so if you're looking to learn a little bit more about this, feel free to reach out to myself or Michael Levy for more information.
Great.
Kristen, I know we're a little bit over time. Just want to give an opportunity for people to ask questions. I don't know if we have that kind of time available right now, though.
Yeah, we do, and we can also go a little bit longer if there are more questions. One question that came in through the chat was, and I think you answered it, but can I share the PowerPoint slides with the group?
Yeah, of course. We'll send these out right after.
Awesome, will do. Thank you. I think there was also a question, if you could maybe explain how risk monetization is different than risk reduction spend efficiency. I know Michael already answered some of that in the chat, but maybe Michael, you want to expand on that?
Sure. So any measure of benefits that's not in dollars is really going to be useful for a relative prioritization of investment alternatives against each other, but less useful for determining a total amount of spend on the portfolio. If the commission, or the regulator, or the board is trying to say, what is a prudent level of spend that gives me a positive NPV, if the benefits, in this case, like of that discounted cash flow, are not in dollars, then you can't do that calculation. And so what we're trying to help is shift the industry away from negotiating with the commissioner, the regulator, or the board based on just least cost alternative, and instead value for cost. And when that value is measured in dollars, then now that you can have that back and forth, that trade-off on what is an appropriate level of spend based on customers' willingness to pay for an avoided outage, based on the business disruption that non-residential customers experience from an outage, based on the avoided damage that comes from an ignition, and so forth.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the group? I didn't see anything in the chat, but please raise your hand or unmute yourself. Any further questions for Paul and Michael and Camille? And thank you for the lively chat discussion. People can also refer to that. And Alex from California said, thank you for the development of the landing page, which I also appreciate it, because then I can share that with people. Awesome.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions, just wanted to say thanks again for Kirsten and to Nazio letting us present today. If you think of any questions after this, feel free to reach out to us. We will be sending out the PowerPoint slides that we walked through today, and then in the future a link to that landing page so that these resources are publicly available.
Awesome. And thank you, Michael and Paul put their contact information in the chat. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Paul, Michael, and Camille for joining us and for your amazing work. I know that was a lot of effort and really very helpful. So with that, I will stop the recording.